The mattress dipped, a slow, heavy yield that signaled the shift in gravity I was rapidly becoming addicted to. It was just past 3 a.m. The room was dark, thick with the hum of overheating servers and the silence of the city outside. But the scent of sandalwood and warm skin cut through it immediately. Josephine was climbing into my bed for the 4th night in a row. We had exactly 96 hours until the pitch that would decide if we were visionaries or bankrupt failures. She claimed she couldn't think anywhere else, that the frequency of the room was right for coding. But as she settled in, the heat radiating from her side of the bed suggested an agenda that had nothing to do with algorithms. To understand why my chief technology officer was currently occupying the better half of my queen-size mattress, you have to understand the architecture of our desperation. On LinkedIn, I was the CEO of a disruptive fintech startup operating in stealth mode. In reality, I was a woman living in a 400-square-foot studio in the garment district, eating instant ramen so I could pay for cloud storage. The apartment wasn't just where I slept, it was the entire company. My kitchen island was the conference room. The corner by the window, blocked by a wall of rolling whiteboards, was the engineering department. And the server room was a rack of humming hardware shoved into my walk-in closet, generating enough heat to keep us warm through a New York winter without ever turning on the radiator. Then there was Josephine. If I was the structure holding this chaotic house of cards together, she was the wind threatening to blow it down, or the electricity keeping it alive. I still don't know which. I'd hired her 6 months ago, poaching her from a cushy job at a legacy bank with nothing but a pitch deck and a promise of significant equity. She was brilliant, mercurial, and possessed a terrifying level of precision that made me feel like a messy draft next to her final copy. She wore silk blouses to code in a room that smelled like ozone and stale coffee. She drank espresso from a cup she brought from home because she claimed my mugs disrupted her haptics. She was impossible. She was also the only person who could build the algorithm we needed to secure our Series A funding. Our relationship was built on a foundation of high-stakes panic and rapid-fire debates. We spent 18 hours a day within 5 feet of each other, arguing over user interface latency and monthly burn rates. It was professional, mostly. But you can't spend that much time in a confined space with someone without the edges blurring. I knew she hummed a specific low note when she solved a complex bug. She knew I paced exactly 3 steps to the left and 3 back when I was on a call with investors. We were a 2-woman army fighting a war against irrelevance, and the trench we were digging happened to be my living room. The shift happened on a Tuesday. We were in a code red sprint, literally. The back end was throwing errors that made no sense, and the demo for the venture capital firm was less than a week away. Outside, the city was being battered by a torrential nor'easter that had turned the streets into rivers. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of rain and overheating electronics. Josephine had been standing at the standing desk, my dresser with a stack of architectural books on it, for 6 hours straight. Her eyes were glazed, her posture rigid. "I can't resolve the dependency," she muttered, tapping the enter key with a violence that made me wince. "The logic is sound, but the environment is unstable." "Take a break, Joe," I said from the floor, where I was sorting through a pile of unpaid invoices. "You're going to crash." "I don't crash," she snapped, not looking at me, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. "I optimize." But the city had other plans. At 1 a.m., the lights flickered. At 1:30, my phone buzzed with a notification. All subway lines in our sector were suspended due to flooding. Uber prices were surging to $300 for a ride that usually costs $20. Josephine lived in Brooklyn. We were in Midtown. She stared at her phone, her face pale in the blue light of the monitor. "I can't go home," she said, the realization landing with a dull thud. "You can't go out in this," I agreed, looking at the rain lashing against a single window. "The wind is practically horizontal." She looked around the room. The couch was a love seat, covered in server manuals and cable ties. The floor was hardwood and currently covered in financial projections. That left the bed. My bed. The only soft surface in the entire headquarters. "I need to keep working," she said, her voice tight. "If I lose this flow state, we lose the timeline." "You need sleep," I countered, standing up. The proximity between us suddenly felt different. Usually the work acted as a buffer, a third party in the room. But with the monitors dimming and the storm sealing us in, it was just us. And you can't sleep on the floor, Joe. You have that lower back thing. She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the bed and then back to me. It was a calculation. I could see her running the risk assessment in her head. It's inefficient to commute in the morning anyway, she rationalized, the professional mask slipping back into place. I can be back on the code by 6 a.m. if I stay. Right, I said, my throat suddenly dry. Efficiency. I didn't offer her the couch. I didn't offer to sleep on the floor myself. As I watched her turn off the monitors, plunging the room into shadow, I knew the burn rate wasn't just financial anymore. You take the bed, I said, grabbing a spare pillow from the stack we usually use to prop up the projector during video calls. I'll take the floor. I've slept on worse. There was that hackathon in Berlin where I slept under a folding table for 3 days. My spine is basically purely decorative at this point anyway. Josephine looked at me with that withering, analytical stare she usually reserved for redundant code or poorly thought-out feature requests. She stood by the side of the bed, the only piece of furniture in the room that wasn't currently serving a dual purpose as a desk or a storage unit. Don't be a martyr, she said, her voice cool and clipped. It's bad for company morale. Besides, your floor is unsealed parquet. The draft from the window is suboptimal for REM cycles. If I wake up with a stiff neck, the API integration is delayed by 4 hours minimum. Do you want to explain to the investors that we missed the launch window because the CEO wanted to perform a dramatic act of chivalry? She was weaponizing logic again. It was annoying. It was also effective. It's a queen, she added, unbuttoning her silk cuffs with maddening slowness, her eyes never leaving mine. We are 2 adult women, capable of understanding spatial boundaries. We can share. It's just logistics. Right, I said, tossing the pillow back onto the mattress. Logistics. The process of getting into bed with your chief technology officer is a diplomatic exercise in avoiding eye contact. I turned off the main overhead light, leaving only the amber glow of the server rack LEDs blinking in the closet. The room plunged into a semi-darkness that felt far too intimate for a Tuesday night work crisis. She didn't have pajamas. She borrowed one of my t-shirts, a vintage NASA one that was soft from 1,000 washes. On me, it looked like laundry day. On her, it looked like intentional editorial fashion. She climbed in on the left side, moving with a fluid grace that made my own movements feel clumsy and heavy. We built the wall immediately. A demilitarized zone constructed of 2 throw pillows and a rolled-up duvet down the absolute center of the mattress. It was a physical manifestation of our employment contract. Good night, she said, her voice crisp, turning her back to me instantly. Night, I replied, clinging to the absolute edge of the mattress on my right side, my shoulder practically hovering over the floor. The silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Usually I fell asleep to the comforting, anonymous white noise of the city. Sirens, garbage trucks, the distant rumble of the subway. Now, my ears were tuned to a frequency I hadn't authorized, the rhythm of her breathing. The sensory landscape of my apartment shifted. The smell of ozone and stale coffee, the permanent perfume of a startup, was pushed back by something warmer. Her. It was subtle, sandalwood maybe, or something spicy and expensive that lingered on her skin. It was terrifyingly domestic. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, where a water stain looked vaguely like a map of South America, trying to force my brain back to the pitch deck. Slide 4 needs more data on user acquisition costs. Slide 7 is too text-heavy, but my brain kept traitorously switching tabs. Her foot is 6 inches from my calf. If she rolls over, her hand will hit my hip. The heat radiating from her is raising the ambient temperature of the bed by at least 3 degrees. Then the mattress shifted. She sighed. A long, unraveling sound that belonged to the woman, not the CTO. Stop thinking so loud, she murmured into the dark, her voice thick with sleep. You're vibrating. I'm strategizing. You're panicking. Go to sleep. I'll fix the dependency in the morning. Her voice was softer, stripped of the boardroom armor. It did something to my chest that I couldn't quantify in a spreadsheet. I didn't think I would sleep, but the exhaustion of the sprint, combined with the strange, grounding weight of another person in the empty space, dragged me under. When I woke, the light was gray and unforgiving, filtering through the blinds I'd forgotten to close. The wall had failed. The pillows were on the floor. The rolled-up duvet had been kicked to the foot of the bed, and Josephine was no longer on her side. She had gravitated toward the center, toward the heat. Her head was resting on the pillow next to mine, her dark hair fanned out in a chaotic halo that contradicted her entire personality. Her hand was resting on my stomach. Not gripping, just there. Heavy. Warm. Possessive. I froze. My heart hammered a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs, terrified it would wake her. This was a violation of every boundary we had established. This was a disaster waiting to happen. I should have moved. I should have rolled away, coughed, made a noise to wake her up so we could reset the professional distance before she opened her eyes. I didn't. I lay there for 10 minutes, watching the dust motes dance in the gray light, feeling the weight of her hand rising and falling with my breath. But as she shifted in her sleep, her fingers curling slightly into the fabric of my shirt, I knew I wasn't protecting her sleep. I was protecting the feeling of not being alone in the trench. By Wednesday evening, the intimacy of the apartment had become an atmospheric pressure system I couldn't navigate. The air was too thick with the memory of her hand on my stomach, too heavy with the scent of her sandalwood soap that now clung to my own sheets. Every time she reached past me for a dry erase marker, the brush of her silk sleeve against my arm felt less like a colleague's gesture and more like a conversation. I needed neutral ground. I needed sterility. I needed a place where the lighting was designed to kill romance and keep you awake until your retinas burned. So I forced us to evacuate to The Nexus, a 24-hour co-working space in Soho that boasted ergonomic freedom and unlimited cold brew, but mostly just offered harsh fluorescent lighting and the collective anxiety of 100 other failing startups. The environment was antiseptically hostile. We claimed a glass-walled cube near the back, surrounded by empty desks and the low, aggressive hum of industrial HVAC. It was freezing. The kind of cold that settles in your bones and makes your fingers stiff on the keyboard. Josephine hated it immediately. She sat in the expensive mesh chair like it was a torture device, her posture rigid, her expression one of profound, aristocratic offense. "This feng shui is aggressive," she muttered, adjusting her monitors with unnecessary violence. "The color temperature of these lights is all wrong. It's too blue. It suppresses melatonin but spikes cortisol. It's inefficient." "Just code, Joe," I said, wrapping my cardigan tighter around myself. "We need the back end stable for the load test tomorrow." For 3 hours, we worked in a silence that was fragile and sharp. The only sounds were the furious clatter of her mechanical keyboard and the distant wail of a siren on Broadway. But the change of venue didn't fix the problem. It only highlighted it. In the apartment, our proximity felt organic, a byproduct of the small space. Here, under the glare of the overheads, it felt deliberate. The crisis struck just past midnight. A critical bug in the demo environment caused the entire user database to decouple from the front end. 1 minute the dashboard was live, the next it was a wall of red error codes. No, 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 Josephine hissed, sliding her chair over to my side of the desk. "Look at the trace log. The API handshake is failing." She didn't just point at the screen. She invaded my space to fix it. She rolled her chair until our armrests were locked together, leaning over my shoulder to take control of my mouse. The contact was sudden and electric. Her shoulder pressed against mine, a solid, warm weight in the freezing room. Her hair, loose and messy from hours of frustration, brushed against my cheek, smelling of rain and that maddening vanilla shampoo. We were huddled together in the blue light of the monitor, 2 women trying to save a company. But the dynamic had shifted. I wasn't looking at the code. I was looking at the line of her jaw, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the pulse jumping in her neck. "I can't see the root cause," she said, her voice dropping to a frustration-laced whisper that felt far too intimate for an office. She turned to look at me, and we were inches apart. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, buzzing like a trapped insect, but the silence between us was deafening. Her eyes searched mine, not for code, but for something else. Grounding, maybe? Reassurance? "It's the environment," she announced suddenly, pushing her chair back. The wheels screeched against the polished concrete, breaking the spell. "I can't think here. The energy is sterile. It's killing the creative logic." "Joe, we have to fix this," I argued. though my heart was still hammering from the proximity. "Not here," she insisted, standing up and grabbing her coat. "My back is seizing up in this chair. The ergonomics are a lie. We're going back to base." Base meant the apartment. It meant the bed. We took a cab back in the rain. The city blurred past the windows in streaks of neon and gray, but inside the car, the atmosphere was heavy. We sat on opposite sides of the back seat, a deliberate foot of leather between us. But the silence wasn't empty. It was charged. I watched her profile as she stared out the window, the streetlights carving shadows across her face. She looked exhausted, the sharp angles of her confidence softened by fatigue, to reveal the terrifying vulnerability underneath. She wasn't just a CTO demanding better working conditions. She was a woman, retreating to the only place she felt safe. And I wasn't just her CEO. I was the keeper of the sanctuary. When the cab pulled up to my building, the relief was palpable. We didn't say a word as we rode the elevator up, the numbers ticking higher, carrying us back to the warmth, back to the scent of sandalwood, back to the inevitable gravity of the mattress. Returning to the apartment didn't feel like going back to work. It felt, dangerously, like coming home. By Thursday, the emergency had mutated into a lifestyle. The apartment had developed its own ecosystem, a fragile bubble of humidity and soft light that existed separately from the brutal deadlines waiting outside. Waking up became the most dangerous part of the day. The night provided the cover of unconsciousness. You can't be held liable for where your hands drift when you're in REM sleep. But morning light required accountability. The fourth morning, I woke up before the alarm. The room was washed in that pale, underwater blue of dawn. I wasn't on my edge of the mattress anymore. I was anchored in the center, and Josephine was the weight holding me down. Her arm was thrown across my waist, heavy and absolute. Her face was pressed into the space between my shoulder and neck, her breath warm and rhythmic against my skin. I could smell the sleep on her, a warm, musky scent that lay beneath the sandalwood, something human and unguarded. It was terrifying. It was the kind of intimacy that takes years to earn, and we had stumbled into it in a week because of a software bug. I lay there for 20 minutes, paralyzed. Not by fear, but by a sudden, overwhelming desire to not move. I wanted to stay in the suspended reality, where she wasn't my brilliant, sharp-tongued CTO, but just a woman seeking heat. I wanted to turn into her, to close the gap, to wake her up with something softer than a status update. The thought sent a spike of adrenaline through me that was sharper than caffeine. When she finally stirred, the extraction was a masterpiece of feigned ignorance. She groaned, shifted, and pulled her arm back with a slow, languid movement that suggested she knew exactly where it had been. We rolled away from each other, creating a sudden, cold distance in the bed. "Morning," she croaked, her voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, staring at the ceiling, my heart rate slowly returning to double digits. "Coffee?" "Intravenously, please." The bathroom routine was an even more complex dance. My bathroom is the size of a phone booth, designed for one person who doesn't own many products. With two of us, it was a logistical puzzle. We stood shoulder to shoulder at the tiny sink, the mirror reflecting a version of us that looked deceptively like a couple. I watched her in the glass. She was applying moisturizer with a focused, rhythmic precision, tapping the cream under her eyes. It was such a mundane, private act. Seeing her like this, hair messy, face bare, defenses down, felt more illicit than seeing her naked. I was learning the map of her morning, the way she tilted her head to check her jawline, the specific frown she made when she couldn't find her hair tie. "The user acquisition costs are trending down," she said suddenly, her eyes meeting mine in the mirror while she capped a bottle of serum. The transition from domestic silence to business metrics was so abrupt it was almost funny. It was a shield. She was building the wall back up with data points. "I saw," I said, squeezing toothpaste onto my brush, our elbows bumping. "But the retention on the beta group is still shaky. We need to optimize the onboarding flow." "I'm rewriting the load sequence today," she mumbled around her toothbrush. "It'll fix the latency." We were discussing the survival of our company while spitting into the same sink, surrounded by the steam of a shared shower. It was absurd. It was perfect. And that's when the realization hit me, heavy and undeniable. I wasn't just tolerating this invasion of my space. I was thriving on it. For 2 years, I had slept alone in this apartment, waking up every few hours with my mind racing about cash flow and burn rates. The silence had been an echo chamber for my anxiety. But with Josephine here, with the sound of her breathing filling the room and the weight of her body on the mattress, the panic was quiet. I was sleeping 6 hours straight. I was waking up rested. She wasn't just fixing the code. She was debugging my insomnia. The proximity wasn't a bug. It was a feature. I just hoped she wouldn't patch it out. By Friday evening, the apartment felt less like a headquarters and more like a submarine running out of oxygen. The walls, covered in layers of architectural diagrams and flowcharts, seemed to be physically closing in. The hum of the servers in the closet had drilled a hole into my temporal lobe, and the smell of stale coffee was no longer a stimulant. It was a nauseating reminder of how long we had been awake. We had been coding, refining, and rehearsing for 72 hours straight. The pitch was now a tangible thing on the horizon, a cliff edge we were sprinting toward. "I can't breathe," Josephine said suddenly. She was standing in the middle of the room, staring at a whiteboard marker like it was an alien artifact. "The air density in here is wrong. I need verticality." "Roof," I said, grabbing my keys. "Now." We climbed the fire stairs to the roof of my building. It was a gravel-covered expanse of tar and vents, cluttered with HVAC units and pigeon spikes, but to us, it looked like freedom. The night air was biting, a sharp, cold slap of November wind that instantly cleared the static from my head. Below us, the city was a sprawling grid of amber and neon, a circuit board of millions of lives that had nothing to do with our startup. Josephine walked to the edge, leaning her elbows against the rusted parapet. She wasn't wearing a coat, just that thin silk blouse and my cardigan she'd stolen 3 days ago. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't move to brush it away. She looked out at the skyline, her profile sharp and severe against the glow of Midtown. "You could be in a warm office right now," I said, stepping up beside her. The gravel crunched under my boots. "You could be at Chase, collecting a bonus and sleeping in your own bed in Brooklyn." "Chase was a morgue with a dental plan," she said, her voice snatched away by the wind. She didn't look at me. I was safe, but I was atrophying. My brain was rotting on spreadsheets. "And here?" I asked. "Here, you're sleeping on a mattress with a CEO who can barely make payroll, eating ramen, and risking your entire reputation on a platform that might crash on Monday." She finally turned. The moonlight washed her face in silver, highlighting the exhaustion etched under her eyes. But also something fiercer. "Here, I'm terrified," she admitted. The confession was quiet, stripped of her usual bravado. "You think I'm this machine, this algorithm in heels. But half the time, I'm just pattern matching. I'm guessing. I'm building bridges while I'm running on them, and I'm terrified I'm going to look down and realize there's nothing underneath." "You're not guessing, Joe. You're brilliant." "I'm chaotic," she corrected, shifting her weight so she was facing me fully. "I'm a fire hose of raw data. I need a container. I need structure." She took a step closer, invading my personal space again, but out here in the cold, I welcomed the heat. "That's why I'm here. You're the structure. You're the only person who doesn't look at my chaos and panic. You just organize it. You make me make sense." The vulnerability in her voice hit me harder than the wind. This wasn't the arrogant CTO who demanded ergonomic chairs. This was the woman who had been curling into my side for 4 nights, seeking a steady pulse to anchor herself against. "I'm just trying to keep the lights on," I whispered. "You're doing more than that," she said. She moved then, closing the last few inches between us. We were standing toe-to-toe against the railing, the city dropping away behind us. The cold was intense, biting at my exposed skin, but the heat radiating from her was magnetic. I could smell the sandalwood again, sharp and clean in the cold air. She looked up at me, her dark eyes searching mine with a terrifying intensity. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes. It wasn't a professional look. It was a question. It was a challenge. The wind died down for a second, leaving us in a vacuum of silence where the only sound was the blood rushing in my ears. My hand twitched. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to brush the hair out of her eyes, to touch the cold skin of her cheek and feel the warmth underneath. I wanted to pull her in, not to block the wind, but to answer the question hovering between us. The pitch didn't matter. The investors didn't matter. The only thing that existed was the gravity pulling me toward her. She leaned in. I saw her eyelids flutter. I stopped breathing. Bzzz. The phone in my pocket vibrated against my hip with the violence of a drill. It was the harsh staccato buzz of a pager duty alert. We jumped apart like we'd been electrocuted. The spell shattered instantly, replaced by the cold reality of the rooftop. I fumbled for the phone, the screen lighting up my face with a harsh white glare. Alert. Critical latency spike. Node 4 unresponsive. It's the load balancer, I said, my voice shaking, though not from the cold. Josephine was already moving toward the door, the vulnerability gone instantly. I know exactly what it is, she said, her voice hard and precise. Let's go. But as she pulled the heavy metal door open, she paused. She looked back at me one last time, and for a second, the mask slipped again. We aren't done with this conversation, she said. Then she disappeared into the stairwell, leaving me alone in the cold, my heart racing for all the wrong reasons. We stabilized the load balancer at 3:15 a.m. The crisis had passed, leaving us with that specific, vibrating exhaustion that comes after an adrenaline dump. We hadn't eaten in 12 hours. The ramen supply was depleted, and the thought of another protein bar made my stomach turn. So, we retreated to the only establishment in Midtown that wouldn't ask us why we looked like we'd just survived a natural disaster. The Galaxy Diner. It was a relic of a dying New York. Chrome that hadn't been polished since the 90s, vinyl booths taped together with duct tape, an air that smelled permanently of bacon grease and floor wax. The lighting was a harsh, unforgiving yellow that made everyone look jaundiced. But for once, Josephine didn't complain about the color temperature. She slid into the booth opposite me, her silk blouse wrinkled, her eyes dark with fatigue, and she looked devastatingly beautiful. We ordered enough food to feed a linebacker. Pancakes, eggs, home fries, toast. When the waitress arrived with the coffee pot, she paused, looking between us with a soft, knowing smile. Josephine was leaning across the table, showing me a schematic on her phone, her hand brushing mine to point out a node. To an outsider, the body language was undeniable. We were leaning into each other's gravity. You two celebrating something? The waitress asked, pouring the coffee. Anniversary? The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. No, I said, the word firing out of my mouth too quickly, too loudly. I pulled my hand back from the table like I'd been burned. We're business partners. Colleagues. Just working late. The waitress blinked, her smile faltering slightly. Oh, my mistake. You have that look. She walked away, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the one on the rooftop. Josephine didn't look up from her phone, but I saw the corner of her mouth tighten. I stirred sugar into my coffee, watching the vortex of black and white, feeling a sudden, sharp twist of shame. I had corrected the woman to protect the professional narrative, but it felt like a betrayal of the reality we were living in the dark. The latency is down to 40 milliseconds, Josephine said quietly, refusing to acknowledge the moment. It's acceptable. It's good, Joe, I said, my voice sounding thin. We ate in a comfortable silence until the door chimed. A group of guys spilled in, loud and smelling of cheap beer, coming down from a night at the bars. They took the booth next to us. One of them, a guy in a fitted shirt that was trying too hard, locked eyes on Josephine immediately. I saw the calculation happen in real time. He saw a woman in a silk blouse in a dive diner at 4 a.m. He saw an opening. Hey, he said, leaning over the partition, invading our booth's airspace. You realize you're way too classy for this place, right? You look like you should be drinking champagne, not whatever that sludge is. He gestured to her coffee. He didn't even look at me. I was invisible. Just the friend. The obstacle. A surge of proprietary heat flooded my chest. It wasn't the protective instinct of a CEO guarding her CTO from harassment. It was raw, ugly jealousy. I wanted to tell him to back off. I wanted to tell him that he didn't know how she took her coffee, or how she hummed when she coded, or how her feet were currently tangled with mine under the table. I gripped my fork, my knuckles turning white. She's working, I snapped, my voice icy. The guy laughed, dismissive. Relax, boss. I'm just paying a compliment. He turned back to Josephine, flashing a smile that was supposed to be charming. What's a girl like you doing with a laptop on a Saturday night? Josephine finally looked up. She didn't look annoyed. She looked bored. She looked at him with the same clinical, dissecting stare she used on buggy code. I'm building a proprietary algorithm that processes financial transactions faster than the human nervous system can register a pain response, she said. Her voice was calm, precise, and utterly terrifying. And currently, you are introducing a high level of noise into my signal. If you don't return to your quadrant, I'm going to calculate the exact trajectory required to spill this boiling coffee into your lap. And I never miss. The guy blinked. The smile vanished. He processed the threat, looked at her dead flat eyes, and decided the risk assessment wasn't in his favor. Jesus, okay, chill. He retreated to his booth, muttering something about psycho. Josephine turned back to her pancakes, unbothered. She took a sip of her coffee. I hate the public, she murmured, almost to herself. Too many variables. Too much erratic data. She looked at me then, and her expression softened. The ice melted. That's why I like the apartment, she said, her voice dropping to that intimate register that made my toes curl. It's a closed loop, just us. The data is clean. It's quiet, I agreed, my heart thumping against my ribs. It's not just quiet, she corrected, reaching across the table to steal a piece of my toast. It's focused. Out here, I have to filter everything. In there, with you, I can just run. We finished eating in a silence that wasn't awkward anymore. It was expectant. The walk back to the apartment was cold, the wind cutting through our clothes, but we walked close enough that our shoulders brushed with every step. I didn't pull away. Neither did she. The waitress had been wrong about the anniversary, but she hadn't been wrong about the look. We were celebrating something, even if we hadn't named it yet. We were celebrating the fact that the rest of the world was noise, and we were the only signal that mattered. The catastrophe didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with a hum that suddenly, violently, cut out. It was 48 hours before the pitch, Sunday afternoon. The apartment was bathed in a deceptive, lazy sunlight that felt mocking, given the adrenaline coursing through our veins. We were running the final migration, moving the localized database to the live cloud environment. It was a routine procedure. We had rehearsed it 3 times. Then the terminal froze. A single line of white text blinked on the black screen. Fatal exception. Corruption detected in Sector 7. Josephine didn't move. She didn't type. She just stared at the screen, her face draining of color, until she looked like a marble statue of a saint who had just lost her faith. The silence in the room was absolute, heavier than the server hum had ever been. It's gone, she whispered. The precision was gone from her voice. It was hollow. The encryption key fragmented during the transfer. The data is locked. It's just noise now. We have backups, I said, my voice calm, the CEO override kicking in despite the ice spreading in my stomach. The corruption mirrored to the backup, she said, standing up slowly. Her hands were shaking. I had never seen Josephine shake. She was the woman who coded through a subway power outage. She was the woman who stared down venture capitalists without blinking. Now, she was vibrating. I missed a dependency. I missed it. I broke it. She turned away from the desk and started walking toward the door. She wasn't going to the bathroom. She was grabbing her coat. She was grabbing her bag. She was fleeing the scene of the crime. "Joe, stop," I said. "I have to go," she said, her voice rising, cracking. She was fumbling with the zipper of her bag, her coordination gone. "I can't be here. I can't look at you. I just cost us everything. The company is dead. I killed it." Josephine. "I'm a fraud!" she screamed, the sound tearing through the quiet apartment. "I'm not a genius. I'm just a mess who got lucky. And now the luck ran out. Let me go!" She reached for the door handle. I moved faster. I slammed my hand against the wood right next to her head, sealing the exit. I didn't touch her, but I blocked her path completely. We were chest to chest in the narrow entryway, the air between us charged with panic and failure. "You are not leaving," I said, my voice low and hard. "You don't get to run just because it got messy." "It's not messy, it's over!" She tried to push past me, her hands shoving against my shoulders. She was strong, fueled by adrenaline and shame. "I ruined it. I ruined us." "You didn't ruin us," I said, catching her wrists. Her skin was clammy, her pulse racing under my thumbs. Look at me. She wouldn't. She was staring at the floor, tears finally spilling over, hot and fast. I can't fix it. I don't know how to fix it. Then we'll figure it out, I pulled her in. It wasn't a professional hug. It was a collision. I wrapped my arms around her waist and pulled her body flush against mine. She resisted for a second, rigid with shame, and then she collapsed. The strings cut. She buried her face in my neck and sobbed, a raw, guttural sound that vibrated through my own chest. I walked us backward, away from the door, guiding her blindly until the back of my legs hit the mattress. We sank down together. Not for sleep, not for sex, but because gravity was the only thing making sense. I pulled her into the center of the bed, wrapping my limbs around her, creating a physical cage to hold her together while she fell apart. She curled into me, small and terrified. I stroked her hair, over and over, a repetitive, soothing motion while she shook. I'm sorry, she gasped into my shirt. I'm so sorry. Breathe, I commanded softly, my lips against her temple. Just breathe. We aren't a code base. We're people. And we are still here. We lay there for an hour. The sun moved across the floor. The monitor blinked its fatal error in the background. Ignored. Slowly, the shaking stopped. The hierarchy dissolved completely in that hour. There was no CEO or CTO. There were just two women in a dark room, holding on to each other because the world outside was too big and too unforgiving. She pulled back just enough to look at me. Her eyes were red, her face blotchy, stripped of all the armor she wore so well. She looked wrecked. She looked beautiful. I think I know how to bypass the encryption, she whispered, her voice rough. I know you do, I said, wiping a tear from her cheek with my thumb. But not yet. Stay here. I'm not going anywhere, she said. And for the first time, it sounded like a promise that had nothing to do with the company. The crash had broken the code, but it had fixed something else. The barrier was gone. We were open. The silence that settled over the apartment at 11 p.m. on Sunday was different from the silence of the crash. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating vacuum of failure. It was the hum of stability. The monitor that had been screaming red error codes was now pulsing with a steady, rhythmic green beat. The database was restored. The latency was non-existent. The deck was finalized, saved, and backed up in 3 different cloud locations. We had done it. We had pulled the company back from the brink of extinction with nothing but caffeine, adrenaline, and shared panic. Technically, the sprint was over, and that was the problem. For the last 5 days, the crisis had been the glue holding us together. It was the justification for the shared space, the shared meals, and the shared bed. We have to be close because the work demands it. But now, the work was done. The trains were running on schedule. The storm had passed, leaving the city scoured clean and cold. Josephine had a functional apartment in Brooklyn with a bed that I assumed didn't have a dip in the middle. There was absolutely no logistical, professional, or practical reason for her to stay. I stood by the window watching the traffic on 8th Avenue, feeling a hollow ache in my chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. I was waiting for the sound of her zipper. I was waiting for the rustle of her coat, the click of her heels, the polite, "See you at the office at 8 a.m." I was bracing myself for the return of the solitude I had lived with for 2 years. But the sound never came. Instead, I heard the soft, deliberate click of the main monitor being powered down. Then the secondary screen. Then the overhead light. The room plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the amber streetlights filtering through the blinds and the soft green blink of the server rack. I turned around. Josephine wasn't packing. Her bag was still untouched by the door. She was standing at the foot of the bed, wearing that same vintage NASA t-shirt she had claimed as her uniform. She looked tired, yes, but she didn't look like she was leaving. She looked like she was waiting. "The trains are running," I said. It was a test. A weak, terrified offering of an out I didn't want her to take. "I know," she replied. Her voice was quiet, steady in the dark room. "You have your own bed. It probably has better lumbar support." "It does," she agreed. She took a step closer, moving into the space that had become ours by default. "It's a memory foam hybrid, very ergonomic. "So," I breathed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, "why are you still standing here?" Josephine looked at me. In the shadows, her eyes were dark pools, unreadable and intense. She didn't answer with logic. She didn't talk about efficiency or commute times or optimal rest cycles. She just walked around to her side of the bed, her side, and pulled back the duvet. "Because I can't think over there," she said simply, climbing in. "And I don't want to think about the pitch anymore. I just want to sleep." She lay down, and the mattress dipped, shifting the gravity of the room instantly. The invitation was silent, absolute, and terrifying. I walked to the bed. My legs felt heavy, not with fatigue, but with the weight of the decision I was making. Getting into this bed tonight wasn't a necessity. It was a declaration. I turned off the bedside lamp, plunging us into total darkness, and climbed in. The distance was gone before I even settled. Usually, we started on our edges and drifted. Tonight, we met in the middle immediately. I felt the warmth of her body along the entire length of mine, shoulder, hip, leg. It wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate alignment. We lay there in the quiet, the air thick with everything we hadn't said for a week. The scent of sandalwood and rain was overwhelming, a sensory blanket that wrapped around us. "It wasn't the mattress," she whispered. The confession hung in the air, fragile as glass. I turned my head on the pillow. Her face was inches from mine, a pale sketch in the gloom. "I know. And it wasn't the back pain. I know that too. And the couch isn't actually that uncomfortable," she added, a note of self-deprecation in her voice. I hated the idea of being across the room. I needed the proximity. The data is just better when you're close." "Josephine," I said, reaching out. My hand found her waist in the dark. It was the first time I had touched her without the excuse of a crisis or a cramped booth. Her skin was warm through the thin cotton of the shirt. I felt her breath hitch, a sharp intake of air that betrayed her composure. "We aren't talking about data anymore." "No," she breathed, her hand coming up to rest on my chest, right over my racing heart. "We aren't." She moved then, shifting closer until there was no air left between us. Her forehead rested against mine. It wasn't a kiss, not yet. It was a negotiation. It was the ratification of a new contract, where the terms were heat, breath, and the undeniable fact that we were no longer just two women trying to save a company. We were two women trying to save each other from the cold. "Tomorrow is going to be a war," she murmured, her thumb tracing the line of my collarbone, sending shivers down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "We have to be perfect." "We will be," I promised, my hand tightening on her waist, pulling her flesh against me. "But right now, we're just here. The war can wait." "Good," she whispered, "because I'm not leaving this bed until I absolutely have to." We fell asleep like that, entangled, deliberate, and undefended. There were no pillows between us, no excuses. Just the quiet, heavy truth that the most valuable asset in this apartment wasn't the code on the server. It was the woman in my arms. The boardroom was a shark tank encased in acoustic glass. 5 partners sat across the mahogany table, men who had dismantled companies for sport, waiting for us to bleed. But they didn't know we had spent the last week fusing our nervous systems in a 400-square-foot pressure cooker. When the lead investor drilled down on our latency issues, I didn't even have to look at Josephine. I felt her straighten beside me, a physical shift in the air. I fielded the market strategy, and she seamlessly picked up the technical baton before I'd even finished my breath. It was telepathy. It was a dance. We were a two-headed hydra of competence, answering questions with a synchronized rhythm that filled the room. When the term sheet finally slid across the table, the numbers were staggering. We were fully funded. We were safe. Champagne was opened. Handshakes were exchanged. We walked out onto Park Avenue as victors, the wind whipping our coats, the adrenaline crashing into a strange, hollow reality. "We did it," Josephine said, checking the wire transfer notification on her phone. "Yeah," I said, staring at the traffic. "We did." But as we rode the elevator back up to the apartment, the triumph turned to ash in my mouth. Success meant resources. Resources meant options. The logic that had kept Josephine in my bed, the poverty, the necessity, the lack of time, was gone. She could afford a penthouse in Tribeca now. She could afford a bed that didn't dip in the middle. The startup house was just an apartment again. And I was just a CEO, not a lifeline. Inside, the room felt different. The crisis was over. I started unplugging the demo unit, my movements jerky and angry. I was packing up the war room, and it felt like I was packing up us. I guess you can call a mover, I said to the wall, yanking a cable free. Get your stuff out of storage. You can probably get a place with a doorman now. A view. I waited for the agreement. I waited for the polite, "It's been fun." I could, Josephine said. Her voice was uncomfortably close. I turned. She hadn't moved to pack. She was leaning against the doorframe, watching me with that maddening, unreadable expression. "But I'm renegotiating my contract," she announced, stepping into my space. "The equity is fixed, Joe," I said, my voice tight, trying to hold the professional line while my heart shattered. "Not the equity," she corrected, stalking toward me. "The benefits package. Specifically, the housing stipend." "You don't need a stipend anymore. You're rich." "It's not about the money," she said, stopping inches from me. She reached out, her hand landing heavily on my waist, pulling me away from the server rack. "I've analyzed the data. My performance metrics drop by 40% when I'm not within arm's reach of you. I can't sleep in a quiet room. I need the hum. I need the breathing." "Joe," I whispered, the fight draining out of me. "The shared accommodation clause," she murmured, her eyes dropping to my lips. "It's non-negotiable. I'm not moving out. I'm upgrading the mattress. I'm buying an espresso machine that doesn't taste like battery acid. But I am staying in the bed." "That sounds expensive," I managed to say. "I'm willing to pay the cost," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," I breathed. She kissed me then. Not a question, but a merger. It tasted like champagne and exhaustion, a chaotic mix of relief and desire that made my knees weak. We stumbled back, not toward the door, but toward the center of the room, toward the gravity well that had been pulling us together for weeks. It was the final signature on the only deal that mattered. The whiteboards are still up, but the panic is gone. The bed isn't a workspace anymore. It's a sanctuary where we recharge for the next war. We saved the company, but looking at Josephine asleep beside me, her hand still claiming my waist, I know the real return on investment wasn't the millions in the bank. It was this. If you've ever found love in the trenches of ambition, subscribe. And check the next video for more stories about risking it all.